There is a registry key on Windows holding a list of files that Windows is not allowed to touch. The key sits at HKey local machine, then system, then current control set, then control, then session manager, then a value called pending file rename operations. Open it today and you may find nothing. Open it the day after an update lands and you will find a queue. File names, paired up, one old path, one new path waiting to take its place. Windows knows which files it needs to replace. It has already downloaded them, they are sitting on your disk, and it cannot do it. So, it writes the list into the registry, like a note left on a fridge, and it waits. When you restart, before the desktop loads, before any program opens, a process called Session Manager, sms.exe, reads that list and swaps the files over in silence. That is the restart. That is the whole thing. Not a magic finishing step. Not a cleanup. A queue of files that could not be replaced while the operating system was awake, being replaced in the few seconds before it wakes up. None of this is secret. Microsoft documents it in public. Mark Rusinovich, who co-founded sysinternals with Bryce Cogswell in 1996 and is today Chief Technology Officer of Microsoft Azure, ships a small free utility called PendMoves, whose entire job is to print that queue out for you. Linux does not have that queue. It does not need one. And the reason goes back to a decision made decades before either operating system was on your desk. Let's start with why Windows is stuck. Because it is not one problem. It is four. Windows ties a file to its name and its path. When a running program opens a file, Windows takes a lock on that path and the kernel enforces it. Nothing else can replace what sits there. Not politely requested. Enforced. For ordinary documents, that is sensible. For the operating system, it is a trap, and Microsoft lists 4 separate roads into that trap in its own support documentation. 1. A library file loaded into a core Windows process that cannot be stopped while Windows is running. The example Microsoft uses is csrss.exe, a required process. Stop it, and the machine stops with it. 2. An executable currently running as a process Windows depends on. 3. A device driver currently in use, which cannot be unloaded while the hardware is live. 4. Registry entries that Windows reads once at startup and never checks again. 4 different roads, all arriving at the same place, and only the first one is really about file locking. Microsoft has been trying to close them for a very long time. Windows Vista, released to manufacturing in November 2006, shipped something called the Restart Manager. Read the developer documentation, and the stated purpose is blunt. It exists to eliminate or reduce the number of system restarts required to complete an installation or update. It works by shutting down and restarting every service except the truly critical ones to free the files underneath them. A whole dedicated system built specifically to kill the reboot. And you still get the reboot. So what is Linux doing differently? The answer is one paragraph in a manual page, and it has been sitting there since before most of us owned a computer. On Linux, a file name is not the file. A file name is a label pointed at something called an inode, and the inode is where the data lives. The formal rule reads like this: when the last name is removed, the name goes away immediately. But if any process still has that file open, the contents are not deleted, they stay. That process keeps reading them until it lets go. That is not a trick or a workaround. That is the definition of what removing a file means. So when a Linux package manager updates a system library, it does not fight the running programs. It removes the old name, drops the new file in under the same name, and walks away. Everything already running keeps reading the old data, undisturbed, as before. Everything started after that moment gets the new one. There is a further layer that makes it work cleanly. Modern systems do not load a whole program into memory at startup. They map it and pull pieces off the disk only as they are needed, which means the system genuinely goes back to the disk, to the old file, long after the name is gone, and finds it still sitting there waiting. No queue. No note on the fridge. No restart. If you have followed this far, you already understand your own machine better than most people who use one every day. There is more coming, including the part Microsoft has never said out loud, and the subscribe button is right there. Now let me stop and be straight with you about the limits, because half the internet gets this wrong in the other direction. Linux does not let you write over a running program. Try it, and you get an error that is famous among Linux users. Text file busy. The trick only works if you remove the name first, and then put a new file in place. Remove, then replace, never overwrite. Linux also once had the same kind of hard, kernel-enforced locking that Windows uses. It was added as an option in 2015. Fedora and Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8 switched it off almost immediately, and other distributions followed. Then, in 2021, a kernel developer named Jeff Layton submitted a patch to remove it entirely, and in the message attached to that patch he noted that in all those years, he had heard of one person who ran into trouble because it was gone, and that person was not even using it. The kernel documentation is harsher about why. It describes race conditions in the design that made it undependable, including the possibility of freezing a network file server simply by asking it to read a locked file. The feature was dropped in kernel version 5.14. So, Linux looked at kernel-enforced file locking, tried it, and threw it away. And Linux absolutely does still ask you to reboot. Update the kernel on Ubuntu, and a file appears at var, run, reboot required. A second file beside it lists which packages caused it. The kernel, the core C library, glibc, the init system, systemd, any one of those and you are rebooting. Ubuntu also ships a tool called need restart, included by default since Ubuntu 20.1.04. It goes further than the flag file. It walks through every running process and reports which ones are still holding old library versions after an upgrade. Red Hat is blunter than most Linux advocates on this. Its own guidance says that after a core library update, services carry on using the older library they were loaded with, and the old copies stay on disk, taking up space, until every last program holding them finally closes. There is one more objection, and it comes from inside Microsoft. An engineer at the company wrote publicly, in a post still hosted on Microsoft documentation today, that being able to delete a file in use does not solve anything by itself. The old code is still running. You are still exposed to whatever that patch was meant to fix, and you now have two versions of one component live at once, which can break communication between programs. His conclusion is that on either operating system, you must stop the process for the update to truly take effect. He is right, and it does not rescue Windows. It sharpens the real difference. Linux can restart one service. Windows restarts the entire machine, which brings us to the kernel, and the part where both sides tried to cheat their way out. Somebody worked out that you could patch a running kernel by redirecting the code in memory. The first working version came out of research at MIT and was called Kesplis. Oracle bought it and closed the source. Red Hat answered with Kpatch in 2014. SUSE answered with Kgraft the same year. Then, instead of fighting, the two teams sat down together and built a shared foundation inside the Linux kernel itself, which is what every tool uses today. Be careful with what it does, because this gets oversold constantly. Live patching swaps individual functions inside a running kernel to close a security hole. It does not move you from one kernel version to the next. For a version change, you reboot. On Ubuntu, it is called Live Patch, and Canonical bundles it into a subscription called Ubuntu Pro. That subscription is free for personal use on up to 5 machines. If you are an official Ubuntu community member, the limit rises to 50. Paid, it is $25 a year for a workstation and $500 a year for a server. Now watch what Microsoft did with the same idea. Microsoft built Hotpatching. It applies security fixes directly to code already running in memory. No restart. It came out of internal Azure use, went to preview in 2024, and reached general availability on Windows 11 Enterprise version 24H2 in April 2025. The model is quarterly. January, April, July, and October are baseline months. where a normal cumulative update installs and you restart. The 2 months after each baseline get hot patches, security fixes only, no restart. 12 restarts a year becomes 4. On Windows Server 2025, Microsoft published a blog post headlined around being tired of all the restarts, and then priced the cure at $1.50 per processor core per month. Run that on a 32-core server. $48 a month, $576 a year. One licensing analyst worked it out across 100 servers at 64 cores each and landed above $100,000 a year. That was the price of not rebooting. Then, in mid-May 2026, Microsoft reversed it. Hotpatching through Azure Arc on Windows Server 2025, standard or data center, is now available at no additional cost. No per core meter, no hourly charge, no separate line on the invoice. Billing was stopped for every server already enrolled, and nobody had to lift a finger. Good news! Genuinely, so here's the question. Where is yours? Look at what hotpatching on Windows 11 requires, because the requirement list is the answer. It requires Enterprise Edition, version 24H2 or later. It requires the machine to be enrolled in Microsoft Intune and managed through Windows Autopatch. It requires virtualization-based security switched on. And it requires a license from a specific published list. Windows 11 Enterprise E3 or E5. Microsoft 365 F3. Windows 11 Education A3 or A5. Microsoft 365 Business Premium. Windows 365 Enterprise. Read that list again and notice what is missing. Home is not on it. Pro is not on it. The 2 editions that almost every person watching this video is running do not appear anywhere. In March 2026, Microsoft went further and announced it would switch hotpatching on by default for every eligible managed device, starting with the May security rollout. A good decision and a quiet admission that the restart was always a problem worth solving properly. Consumer machines and unmanaged machines stay on the old restart-based workflow, and no timetable has been announced for changing that. So, the fix exists. It works. It is free on servers now, and the person who paid for a home license on a machine they own outright is not invited. Meanwhile, Canonical hands the equivalent to any individual with 5 machines and an email address. Even inside the walls, the number is softer than the marketing. Microsoft advertises 4 restarts a year. Reporting on the Microsoft Release Health Calendar for 2026 points to an extra baseline landing in June, which would make it 5 this year, and that counts only monthly security servicing. It does not count emergencies out of band fixes, firmware, drivers, or feature upgrades. There is one last detail that is almost too neat. Hotpatching came to ARM-based Windows machines in August 2026. To make it work, those devices have to switch off a compatibility layer called Compiled Hybrid PE. And switching that off requires a restart. You must reboot once in order to stop rebooting. Here's what I want from you. How many times has Windows restarted your machine without asking? In the last 12 months. Put the number in the comments. So, the verdict. Windows needs restarts because of an architectural choice about how files are held, made a long time ago, for an operating system nobody expected to run for months without stopping. Linux almost never needs one for the software you use, because of a different choice made just as long ago about what a file name really is. Neither side is magic here. Linux reboots for a kernel change, and its own tooling tells you so. Windows can now patch memory without stopping. The gap is real, and it is narrower than the arguments online suggest. The part that is not narrow is who gets the cure. From the Restart Manager in Vista to hotpatching in 2025, Microsoft spent the better part of 2 decades solving this, and the solution works. Then it was placed behind an enterprise license, a management platform, and for a year, a bill of $1.50 a core. The bill on servers is gone. The gate on your desktop is not. The restart on your machine stopped being a technical inevitability some time ago. It is now a decision about which customers are worth the effort. Worth remembering, The next time your screen locks you out and tells you not to turn off your computer,